The knock came through the howl of the storm. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a branch. It was a fist against his door. Tawa Greyhawk hadn't heard that sound in 10 years. He sat by the fire, a wool blanket over his shoulders, the muscles in his back tight as coiled rope. Scars ran across his skin like pale rivers, each one a story he never told. He'd grown used to the silence. He'd made it his friend. But this sound, this was an enemy. It was the world trying to get back in. The knock came again, harder this time, desperate. Tawa rose slow, a giant of a man in the flickering light. His hand went to the rifle leaning by the hearth. Instinct. The only thing he had left from the life before this one. He didn't think it was real. He thought the loneliness was finally making him crazy. Then a voice, thin and breaking, cut through the wind. Please. Tawa's eyes narrowed. He moved to the door, each step heavy on the floorboards. The wood groaned as he lifted the heavy bar. He pulled the door open, and the storm exploded inside, a whirlwind of snow and ice like a pack of ghosts, and in the middle of it, 2 figures, 2 women, soaked to the bone, their dresses in tatters, hair plastered to their faces. One was holding the other up, keeping her from falling into the snow. The taller one, with hair the color of autumn leaves, lifted her chin. She was trembling, but her eyes burned with a fire that hadn't gone out yet. The other one, smaller, quieter, was the one who spoke again. Her voice was barely a whisper. Can we stay? Just for the night? For 10 years, no one had come to his door. The settlers in the valley below feared him. They called him a savage, a ghost. They told their children stories to keep them out of his woods. And now 2 of them were standing on his doorstep, begging. Tawa said nothing. He just stared. His silence was a weapon, and he watched it work on them. The tall one stiffened, like she'd rather freeze to death than be looked down on. But the other one just lowered her eyes, and that humility won a battle her sister's pride was about to lose. Finally, he stepped aside. He didn't say a word, just moved his massive frame out of the way. The tall one hesitated, her eyes full of suspicion, but the wind gave her a shove from behind, and they stumbled into the cabin. He shut the door and dropped the bar back into place. The sound echoed like a jail cell locking. For a long moment, nobody moved. They just breathed. The air was thick with the unfamiliar scent of other people. Tawa went back to his spot by the fire, saying nothing. The women huddled by the door, shivering, not daring to come closer. The auburn-haired one, Elsie, finally broke the silence. We'll leave as soon as the storm passes. We don't want your charity. He didn't answer. He just threw another log on the fire. The crackle and pop said more than he could. The quieter one, Evelyn, whispered a soft, "Thank you," and guided her sister toward the warmth. They stretched their pale, trembling hands toward the flames. He watched them from the corner of his eye. He saw the pride fighting with the hunger in Elsie's face. He saw the quiet tears of relief on Evelyn's cheeks. And then he saw something else. On Evelyn's wrist, half hidden by her tattered sleeve, was a small, crudely carved wooden bird hanging from a leather cord. His breath caught in his throat. His world, which had been silent and gray for a decade, suddenly tilted on its axis. He knew that carving. He had made it himself, a lifetime ago. He had carved that bird for his wife, Mourning Dove, the week before she was killed. Tawa's blood ran cold. He stared at the little wooden bird, a ghost from a past he had buried under years of silence and snow. How did this woman have it? Who were they? He felt a rage build in his chest, hot and sharp. He wanted to grab the woman, to demand answers, to shake the truth out of her. But he didn't. He had learned long ago that violence only beget more violence. He stayed in his chair, a statue of stone, while a storm raged inside him that was fiercer than the one outside. He rose from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate, and ladled some venison stew into 2 wooden bowls. He set them on the floor near the women, not looking at them, then returned to his seat. Hunger won the war with pride. They ate fast, their hands shaking so much the spoons rattled against the bowls. Elsie kept shooting him suspicious glances, but Evelyn just ate, her eyes closed as if in prayer. The smell of wet wool and hot stew filled the small cabin. Time stretched on, the storm didn't let up. As night fell, the wind howled like a hungry wolf. The women made a small bed of their shawls near the hearth and huddled together, falling into an exhausted sleep. Tawa did not sleep. He watched. The fire burned low, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He watched the gentle rise and fall of Evelyn's chest. He watched the little wooden bird on her wrist. Every instinct screamed at him. These women were not what they seemed. They hadn't just stumbled upon his cabin by chance. They had been sent. But by who? And for what? The questions burned in his mind. He was so lost in thought that he almost missed it. A faint sound carried on the wind, not hooves, not yet. It was the sound of a dog barking, far down in the valley. A hunting dog. Someone was out in this storm. Someone was looking for something. Or someone. He stood and walked to the small, grimy window, wiping a patch clean with his thumb. He peered out into the swirling darkness. For a moment, he saw nothing but a white wall of snow. Then, a flicker of light. A lantern, bobbing in the distance, moving steadily up the mountain, coming his way. His hand went back to his rifle. He wasn't a fool. He knew trouble when he saw it, and it was walking right up to his door. He turned from the window and looked at the 2 sleeping women. The answer to this puzzle was lying right there, by his fire. He walked over to them, his heavy footsteps silent on the wooden floor. He knelt beside Evelyn, his shadow covering her completely. He reached out a hand, his fingers hesitating for a moment before gently touching the leather cord on her wrist. He needed to see it up close. He needed to be sure. As his fingers brushed her skin, her eyes snapped open. They weren't sleepy or confused. They were wide and sharp, and they were filled with terror. She didn't scream. She just stared up at the giant of a man looming over her, her sister sleeping soundly beside her, and her face was a mask of pure, cold fear. It wasn't the fear of a stranger. It was the fear of being caught. Evelyn's breath hitched. Her eyes darted from his face to his hand, which was now holding the small wooden bird. A single tear rolled down her cheek. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't." Elsie stirred at the sound, her eyes fluttering open. She saw the scene, the giant Apache kneeling over her sister, the look of terror on Evelyn's face, and she scrambled backwards, grabbing a piece of firewood and holding it like a club. "Get away from her!" she hissed, her voice a mix of fear and fury. Tawa didn't move. He didn't even look at Elsie. His eyes were locked on Evelyn. He held up the wooden bird. His voice, when he finally spoke, was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. "Where did you get this?" he asked. The question hung in the air, heavier than the storm. Evelyn started to sob, shaking her head. Elsie scrambled to her feet, placing herself between Tawa and her sister. "We found it," she said quickly, her eyes darting around the cabin, looking for an escape. "On the trail. We didn't steal it, if that's what you're thinking." Tawa rose to his full height, dwarfing both of them. He looked from Elsie's defiant face to Evelyn's terrified one. He knew she was lying. You didn't just find something like that. Not here, not in these mountains. "The man with the lantern," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "He's looking for you." Panic flashed in Elsie's eyes. "We don't know what you're talking about." But he could see the lie. He could smell it. These women weren't just running from the storm. They were running from someone. And that someone was getting closer. The barking of the dog was louder now. It was at the base of the ridge his cabin was built on. Tawa turned back to the window. The lantern was closer, a single angry eye in the darkness. "You brought trouble to my door," he said, his back to them. "You have until he gets here to tell me the truth." Elsie's pride crumbled. She looked at her weeping sister, then at the massive, unmoving man at the window. The fight went out of her. We ran away," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "From town. They accused us of stealing." "Stealing what?" Tawa asked, his voice flat. Elsie hesitated. "A silver locket," she said, "from Hattie Lorne, the preacher's wife. But we didn't do it. She's a liar. She's always hated us." Tawa turned around slowly. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were burning. A silver locket. He remembered a silver locket. His wife had owned one. A simple, beautiful thing he had traded 10 perfect beaver pelts for. It had been on her when he found her, and it had been missing. The pieces started to click into place, forming a picture he didn't want to see. The wooden bird, the silver locket. Hattie Lorne. It couldn't be a coincidence. "This bird," he said, holding it up again. "It was with the locket?" Evelyn nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "Mrs. Lorne. She claimed they were both hers. She said our mother stole them from her years ago. She convinced the sheriff. They were going to arrest us. So you ran." Tawa finished for her. He looked down at the carving in his hand. His past was rushing back at him, an avalanche of pain and anger. 10 years ago, the sheriff had come for him too. They'd accused him of murdering a trapper who had been encroaching on his land. Tawa had fought back, and in the chaos, the sheriff's deputy was killed. They called him a murderer and ran him out of his own lands, putting a bounty on his head that had never been collected. He had always known he was framed. Now, for the first time, he was starting to understand how and why. A hard, vicious knock rattled the door. The dog outside was barking frantically. "Tawa Greyhawk!" a familiar voice boomed. "Sheriff Amos. Open this door! I know you've got him in there!" Tawa looked at the two women. Their faces were pale with terror. They were caught in the same web he had been tangled in 10 years ago, spun by the same spider, Hattie Lorne. He finally understood. This wasn't about a stolen locket. It was about silencing anyone who might know the truth about what really happened a decade ago. But why these girls? What did they know? He didn't have time to ask. The pounding on the door grew more insistent. "If you don't open this door, Greyhawk, we'll break it down," Amos shouted. Tawa made a decision. He had run once. He had hidden in silence for 10 years while his name was cursed and his life was stolen from him. He wouldn't run again. He handed the wooden bird back to Evelyn. "Stay away from the door," he said, his voice calm and steady. He picked up his rifle, checking the load. Elsie watched him, her eyes wide. "What are you going to do?" she whispered. "Finish what started 10 years ago," he said. He walked to the door, took a deep breath, and lifted the bar. The door flew open, and Sheriff Amos stumbled in, followed by 2 armed deputies. They stopped short when they saw Tawa standing there, rifle in hand, his face set like granite. Amos was older now, his face lined and weary, but his eyes held the same cold certainty. "Greyhawk," he growled. "Don't be a fool. Just give us the girls." "They're not going anywhere," Tawa said. His voice was quiet, but it filled the small cabin with a dangerous energy. Amos's eyes narrowed. He glanced past Tawa and saw Elsie and Evelyn huddled by the fire. "Mayfield sisters," he said, his voice softening slightly. "It's over. Come on out. No one else has to get hurt." "We didn't do anything!" Elsie cried out. "Hattie Lorne is lying!" Amos sighed, a weary, frustrated sound. "I'm sure she is," he muttered, so low that only Tawa could hear him. Tawa's eyes sharpened. Did the sheriff just admit he knew Hattie was lying? What was going on here? Before he could process it, one of the deputies, a young, nervous kid, raised his rifle. "Just give 'em up, savage," he stammered. Tawa didn't even flinch. He kept his eyes locked on the sheriff. "You know they're innocent," Tawa said, his voice a low rumble. Amos looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "It doesn't matter," he said. "Hattie has the whole town spun up. My hands are tied." "A man's hands are never tied when he's doing the right thing," Tawa said. That's when Evelyn did something no one expected. She walked forward, past Tawa, until she was standing right in front of the sheriff. She was trembling from head to toe, but she held his gaze. "My father was John Mayfield," she said, her voice small but clear. "He was a trapper. He was your friend." The sheriff's face went pale. He stared at Evelyn as if he were seeing a ghost. "John," he whispered. "He was here 10 years ago," Evelyn continued, her voice gaining strength. "He came to see you. He told you he knew who really killed that trapper. He told you it was Hattie Lorne's husband, and that Hattie helped him cover it up. He told you Tawa Greyhawk was innocent." The cabin was dead silent, save for the crackling fire and the howling wind. The deputies looked at each other, then at the sheriff, their faces a mixture of confusion and shock. Amos looked like he'd been punched in the gut. He staggered back a step, his face ashen. "Your father," he stammered. "He never made it home," Elsie said, stepping up beside her sister. "He disappeared that night. We always suspected." Tawa finally understood. John Mayfield had known the truth, and he had been silenced for it. And now Hattie Lorne was trying to silence his daughters too, using the same lie she had used a decade ago. But there was one piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. He looked at Sheriff Amos, whose tough exterior had completely crumbled. There was guilt in his eyes. More than guilt. There was complicity. "You knew," Tawa said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "You knew I was innocent this whole time." The sheriff looked up, his eyes filled with a decade of shame. He started, but he couldn't finish. He didn't have to. The truth was written all over his face. He hadn't just been a bystander. He had been a part of the cover-up. The young deputy, his face now a mask of disgust, slowly lowered his rifle. The other followed suit. They stared at their sheriff, their boss, a man they had respected, and saw him for what he really was: a coward, a liar, and an accessory to murder. The standoff was over, but the fight was just beginning, because the real monster wasn't in the cabin. She was down in the valley, sleeping soundly in the preacher's house, confident that her secrets were safe. She was wrong. The storm broke with the dawn. The world outside the cabin was silent, buried under a thick blanket of fresh snow. But inside, the air was electric. Sheriff Amos sat slumped in a chair, a broken man. His deputies stood by the door, their faces a mixture of anger and confusion. They had come up the mountain to arrest 2 thieves and had uncovered a 10-year-old conspiracy that implicated their own boss. Tawa stood by the window, looking out at the new day. For the first time in a decade, he felt something other than the cold weight of solitude. He felt a flicker of hope, a chance for justice, not just for him, but for John Mayfield, and for his daughters. Elsie was tending to her sister, who was exhausted but resolute. The terror was gone from her eyes, replaced by a quiet strength Tawa hadn't seen before. They were survivors, just like him. "What happens now?" Elsie asked, her voice steady. All eyes turned to Amos. He looked up, his face haggard. "Hattie Lorne," he said, his voice hoarse. "She runs this town. Her husband, before he died of fever 2 years back, owned the mine, the bank, everything. People are afraid of her. Even if I tell them the truth, they won't believe me. They'll say I'm trying to protect the Indian who killed my own brother." Tawa turned from the window. "Your brother?" Amos nodded. "The deputy who was killed that day. He was my younger brother. Hattie told me you did it. She had witnesses. I was so full of grief and rage, I believed her. I led the posse that ran you out." He buried his face in his hands. It wasn't until later that I started to have doubts. John Mayfield came to me, just like his girl said. He told me he'd overheard Hattie and her husband arguing, that her husband had killed the trapper over a claim dispute, and that my brother had stumbled upon them trying to hide the body. So they killed him too. They made it look like you did it. "And you did nothing?" Elsie asked, her voice laced with contempt. "I was a coward," Amos admitted. "Hattie threatened me. She said she'd ruin me. She said she had enough power to see me hang for helping an Indian escape justice. So I kept my mouth shut. I let an innocent man take the blame for my brother's murder. I've lived with that every day for 10 years. A heavy silence filled the cabin. "So we have no proof," Elsie said, the hope in her voice fading. "It's our word against hers." "Maybe not," Tawa said. Everyone looked at him. He walked over to Evelyn and gently took the wooden bird from her. "John Mayfield gave this to you, didn't he?" Evelyn nodded. "The night he disappeared. He told me to keep it safe. He said it was proof." "Proof of what?" Amos asked. Tawa turned the small bird over in his large, calloused hands. He ran his thumb over a small, almost invisible notch near the tail. He pressed it, and a tiny sliver of wood popped open, revealing a hollow compartment inside. He carefully tipped the bird, and a small, tightly folded piece of paper fell into his palm. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it. It was a page torn from a ledger. On it, in neat handwriting, was a confession. It detailed the murder of the trapper and the deputy, and it was signed by Hattie Lorne's late husband. At the bottom, John Mayfield had added a note. "I take this as proof. If anything happens to me, give this to someone you can trust. Let the truth be known. The truth." It was right here, in his hand, after 10 long years. "It's over, Hattie," Amos whispered, staring at the paper. "It's finally over." But Tawa knew it wasn't that simple. Hattie Lorne wouldn't go down without a fight. They couldn't just ride into town and announce her guilt. She would deny it. She would turn the town against them. She would paint them as liars, trying to frame a grieving widow. They needed more than a piece of paper. They needed to catch the spider in her own web. "We're going back," Tawa said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "All of us." The deputies looked at Amos, who slowly nodded his head in agreement. Elsie and Evelyn stood up, their faces set with determination. They had started this, and they were going to finish it. The journey down the mountain was slow and treacherous. The snow was deep, and the air was bitingly cold. But no one complained. They moved with a shared purpose, a silent army marching to war. As they neared the edge of the valley, they could see the town below, a collection of small wooden buildings huddled together against the cold. It looked peaceful, innocent, but they knew better. They knew what kind of poison was hiding behind those walls. They didn't ride in together. Tawa had a plan. The deputies went first, riding in as if they were returning from a failed search. Tawa, Elsie, and Evelyn slipped into town on foot, using the cover of the woods, and went straight to the sheriff's office. Amos was waiting for them. "It's worse than I thought," he said, his face grim. "Hattie has already spread the word. She's telling everyone that the savage Greyhawk kidnapped the Mayfield girls and that I've gone mad trying to find them. She's got half the men in town deputized, ready to hunt you down." "Let them come," Tawa said. He looked at Elsie and Evelyn. "Are you ready?" They both nodded. The plan was dangerous. It relied on trickery and on Hattie Lorne's own arrogance. But it was the only way. Amos left the office and walked across the street to the church, where Hattie was leading a prayer vigil for the safe return of the Mayfield sisters. A few minutes later, he returned. "She's coming," he said. "She thinks you're here to turn yourselves in." They didn't have to wait long. The door to the sheriff's office burst open, and Hattie Lorne strode in, her face a mask of righteous concern. She was followed by a dozen armed townsmen. "Sheriff!" she exclaimed. "Thank heavens! You found the poor, dear girls. She rushed toward Elsie and Evelyn, her arms outstretched. Oh, you poor things! What did that monster do to you? Elsie and Evelyn stood their ground, their faces cold and hard. He saved us, Hattie, Elsie said, her voice ringing through the silent room. He saved us from you. Hattie stopped in her tracks. Her smile faltered. What are you talking about, child? You must be confused. We're not confused, Evelyn said. We know what you did. We know you and your husband murdered that trapper and the sheriff's brother. We know you framed Tawa Greyhawk. And we know you tried to get rid of us because you were afraid we knew the truth about our father. Hattie let out a shrill laugh. This is absurd. The ravings of frightened children. Sheriff, arrest this man. He's clearly filled their heads with lies. She pointed a trembling finger at Tawa, who stood silently in the corner of the room watching her. The townsmen raised their rifles, but Amos stepped between them and Tawa. Put your guns down, he ordered. There will be no arrests today, not until we've heard all the facts. Facts? Hattie shrieked. The fact is, this savage is a murderer, and these girls are liars. Is this a lie too? Tawa asked. He stepped forward, holding out the small folded piece of paper. Hattie's eyes widened. She recognized the ledger paper. She stared at it, her face draining of all color. For a moment, she was speechless. The townsmen looked at her, then at the paper, their certainty beginning to waver. But Hattie Lorne was a cornered animal, and she was at her most dangerous. She recovered quickly, her face twisting into a sneer. A forged note, a pathetic trick. You think anyone will believe this? I am a grieving widow, a pillar of this community, and he, she spat the word, is a savage. Who are you going to believe? It was the moment Tawa had been waiting for. He knew the note alone wasn't enough. He needed something more. He needed Hattie to condemn herself. You're right, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. A piece of paper can be forged, but a memory cannot. He looked past Hattie, toward the back of the crowd of men. Isn't that right, Mr. Peterson? An old, hunched-over man at the back of the group flinched, as if he'd been struck. All eyes turned to him. He was the town's blacksmith, a quiet man who rarely spoke. I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered. You were there, weren't you? Tawa continued, his voice relentless. The night the deputy was killed, you were one of the witnesses Hattie produced. You told the sheriff you saw me do it. The old blacksmith started to tremble. He wouldn't look at Hattie. You saw Hattie's husband strike the final blow, didn't you, Mr. Peterson? Tawa pressed. You saw him kill the sheriff's brother in cold blood, and Hattie saw you. She threatened you, didn't she? She promised to ruin you, to burn down your smithy with your family inside if you ever told the truth. The blacksmith broke. A decade of guilt and fear came pouring out of him. He fell to his knees, sobbing. She did, he cried out. She made me lie. I saw the whole thing. It was Mr. Lorne. He killed them both. I'm so sorry, Sheriff. I'm so sorry. The room erupted. The townsmen stared at Hattie Lorne, their faces filled with horror and disgust. The pillar of their community. The righteous widow. She was a murderer, a monster. Hattie's face was a mask of pure hatred. She lunged, not at Tawa, but at the confession in his hand, trying to snatch it away. But Tawa was quicker. He closed his fist around it. Hattie shrieked in frustration and turned to run, but the young deputy from the night before stepped in her way, his face hard as stone. It's over, Mrs. Lorne, he said. Justice, after 10 long years, had finally come to the valley. The sun was setting, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of orange and purple. Tawa Greyhawk stood on the porch of the sheriff's office, watching the last of the light fade. The door opened, and Elsie and Evelyn came out. They had been given a room at the hotel, a hot meal, and apologies from nearly everyone in town. Their names were cleared. More than that, their father's name had been honored. He was a hero. They're calling you a hero, too, Elsie said, standing beside him. Tawa shook his head. I'm not a hero. I'm just a man who got tired of running. What will you do now? Evelyn asked, her voice soft. The sheriff says you can have your land back. Everything. Tawa looked up at the mountains, his mountains. They were silent, peaceful. For the first time in a long time, they looked like home. But the cabin felt empty now, in his mind. The silence he had once craved now seemed like a different kind of prison. He looked at the two women standing beside him, two strangers who had crashed into his life and changed everything. They were outcasts, just like him. They understood silence and hardship and the quiet dignity of survival. For years no one knocked on my door, he said, his voice quiet. The silence was loud. He turned to them, and for the first time, a small, sad smile touched his lips. I'm tired of the quiet. Elsie's own lips curved into a smile. Well, she said, my sister and I can be awfully loud. He looked from Elsie's fiery eyes to Evelyn's gentle ones. He saw a future he never thought he would have, a chance not just to live, but to have a life, a family. The storm had passed, and it had washed the whole world clean. It had brought more than snow to his door. It had brought him home. What started with a desperate knock in the middle of a blizzard ended not in vengeance, but in justice. Not in solitude, but in the unlikely creation of a family, forged in fire and ice. Three outcasts who found that the only place they ever really belonged was with each other. If you enjoyed this story of justice and finding family in the most unexpected places, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button. You never know what story will come knocking next.